Spiritualism and Women's Rights in 19th Century America by Anne Braude. All right, Bubs. That's a wonderful introduction. Let's get it on. Chapter 1. Unbroken communication between the infinite and all beings. In 1848, the dedicated Quaker abolitionists Amy and Isaac Post, like the other residents of Rochester, New York, heard rumors of mysterious noises in the nearby village of Hydesville. The rumors told of raps on the walls and furniture of an old farmhouse that occurred only in the presence of two young daughters of the family who inherited it. The apparent intelligence of the mysterious sounds convinced the family and neighbors that the spirit of a murdered peddler buried in the basement made the raps. The residents of Hydesville crowded the house to hear the spirit demonstrate its superhuman knowledge by giving the correct number of raps when asked the age or number of their children. Initially, Amy and Isaac Post paid no more heed to the much touted raps than to the old Salem witch stories. Claims of unaccountable religious experiences were not unusual in western New York State, a section of the country burned over by repeated outpourings of the spirit and auspicious millennial tidings during the evangelical revivals of the Second Great Awakening. The same vicinity, the Finger Lakes region of New York State, gave birth to Mormonism in 1827 and to Millerism, which ultimately became Seventh-day Adventism in the 1840s. But when the Posts learned that the family in which the mysterious sounds occurred was one with which they were well acquainted, they took them more seriously. Isaac Post wrote to his brother and sister-in-law that Kate and Margaret Fox, in whose presence the raps occurred, were girls of 12 and 14 years who used to live in our house at Cornhill, and with whom we always had good understanding. The Fox family deserted the apparently haunted house in hope of peace from the raps. Kate and Margaret were sent to Rochester to live with their older sister, Anne Lee Fish. Here the story probably would have ended, but the interest shown in the rappings by the Post family and the other indefatigable reformers who made up their circle of friends. Why is this stopping? Come back, buddy. Come back. The video has stopped, and that's usually a bad sign. Oh, it's back. All right. Here the story probably would have ended. What's up, Ty Guy? Here the story probably would have ended, but for the interest shown in the rappings by the Post family and the other indefatigable reformers who made up their circle of friends. The Post's home at 36 Sophia Street served as Rochester's headquarters for reform lecturers and fugitive slaves, sometimes housing a dozen passengers on the Underground Railroad in a single night. Noted abolitionist speakers Abigail Kelly, William Lloyd Garrison, and Henry C. Wright relished Amy's hospitality and cherished her friendship. I should love much to look into your home. About once in 24 hours, Rochester abolitionist Frederick Douglass wrote to Amy Post while absent on a speaking tour. Had Douglass looked in on an evening when the Post had no guest, he would have found her sitting by the stove, knitting stockings for the anti-slavery fair in Boston. Isaac Post reported that when Kate and Margaret Fox arrived from Hydesville, they felt very anxious that we should enjoy what they did there. Within a few days, one of the sisters visited the Posts, together with family friends Abigail and Henry Bush. The guests retreated into a bedroom with Amy, and the raps commenced. Isaac described what followed in a letter to his brother. I suppose I went with as much unbelief as Thomas felt when he was introduced to Jesus after he had ascended. When I looked in the door with my countenance so doubting and saw Abigail and Henry looking as though they stood before the judgment seat, I felt rebuked, and much more so when Abby, in her most gentle manner, asked some questions. I heard very distinct thumps under the floor, apparently, and several apparent answers. After this inexplicable experience, the Posts became the Fox sisters' mentors and confidants, gathering a small group to meet weekly in search of the truth that might be revealed by communicating with the dead through the girls' mediumship. Spiritualism joined the host of unpopular but heartfelt causes championed by the tireless reformers. Although later mediums would give verbatim messages from spirits, initially the raps were inarticulate, able to respond only yes or no to specific questions and answer with a number, the number of raps made in succession. Isaac introduced the technique of reciting the alphabet so that the raps could spell words by sounding when the correct letter was reached. The process proved cumbersome and did not always improve the quality of the messages. On one occasion, when the raps demanded the alphabet during dinner, Isaac found it difficult to divide the letters at which raps sounded into words. Finally, the raps revealed, "Put on as much molasses as he likes," hardly the profound revelation for which investigators hoped. More satisfying communications resulted from direct questions, such as those Isaac recorded during a session with Kate and Margaret in November 1848. Dr. Chase, who had recently lost his mother, asked if his mother's spirit was present. The answer was she was. Whether she was happy, she was. Whether her knowledge had increased since she passed away, it had. Whether she continually watched over him, she did. Then he asked about a sister, whether his suspicions in regard to her death were correct. The answer, they were not. Would she have lived if other means had been used? The reply, she would not. Then he asked if he could be convinced that there could be spiritual manifestations. Then he could get no more answers. Because the raps could communicate only in response to questions, the inquirers, rather than the mediums, set the agenda for the first spirit communications. True, even in Hydesville, a shower of affirmative raps greeted the question, "Are you a spirit?" But it was the direct inquiries of the posts and their friends that revealed the presence of spirits other than that of the murdered peddler to whom the first raps were attributed. Persistent and repeated questions produced raps indicating the presence of other spirits, especially the spirits of dead relatives of those present. Investigators used sessions with the Fox sisters relief from the host of anxieties that accompanied separation at death, and many of them received it. The hunger for communication with the dead The hunger for communion with the dead gave spiritualism its content, transforming what may have been a teenage prank into a new religion. Americans wanted to talk to spirits, and they would have found a way to do it with or without Kate and Margaret Fox. Most of the early investigators who set the course of the new movement were Quakers, who, like the Posts, found themselves unable to participate in the Society of Friends because they believed it had strayed from its original principles. Quaker doctrine taught that the Spirit of God lay within each individual, and that this inner light was the primary vehicle for religious truth. The doctrine of the inner light produced an ongoing tension with Quakerism. Quaker tradition emphasized the simple lifestyle and vested authority in meetings to ensure that members complied with rigorous standards of behavior and segregation from the non-Quaker world. But at the same time, Quaker doctrine undermined the authority of meetings and elders to enforce those standards by encouraging anyone who felt moved by the Spirit to speak freely in meetings, and by recognizing the authority of the inner light within each individual. During the antebellum period, friends who felt moved to testify against the injustice of buying and selling human beings were silenced by an increasingly rigid disciplinary structure. Obedience to conscience clashed with obedience to Quaker elders and to the authority of meetings. In 1827, the conflict between the authority of meetings and the freedom of the individual to act according to the promptings of the Spirit caused a split within the Society of Friends. The followers of Elias Hicks, a cousin of Amy Post, withdrew to form separate meetings because they believed that Orthodox Friends meetings had become too formalized and no longer gave adequate freedom for individuals to act according to the dictates of the inner light. Hicks also believed that the Quaker establishment had become too enmeshed with the institutions and material comforts of the world, and that tolerance of slavery confirmed this excessive worldliness. The Post, like many anti-slavery friends, withdrew from their meeting and joined the Hicksites. But even the Hicksite meeting imposed unacceptable restraints. When the Hicksites censured Amy and Isaac for participating in anti-slavery societies with non-Quakers, the Post withdrew to help found yet another group, the Congregational Friends in Waterloo, New York. Pardon? Composed predominantly of ex-friends who wanted greater liberty to express their political views. The term congregational implied the adoption of a congregational form of polity, meaning that the Waterloo meeting did not recognize the authority of the Quaker hierarchy over the local congregation and would not answer to the Hicksite Genesee yearly meeting. The Waterloo Congregational Friends based their beliefs on the Quaker principle that the law of God is written in every human soul. Because human beings were created in the image of God, each one, however less or more perfect be the manifestations of the principles of his nature, was in fact a limited transcript of the perfect architect. Need some water. These views led the Waterloo Friends to conclude that an unbroken chain of communication exists between the infinite and all beings. Oh, man. Of all known facts, they found the existence of this communication between the finite and infinite and the infinite to be first in magnitude and most absorbing in interest. Because God's image resided within each individual, they believed any limitation on absolute freedom of conscience impeded the divine will. In George Fox's exhortation to mind the light, they saw the beginning and end of all religion. They left the Society of Friends because they viewed its increasing regulation of its members' freedom and of expression as impeding communication with God. Within months of the formation of the Waterloo Congregational Friends, its members learned of the raps that occurred in the presence of the Fox sisters, and many accepted the spiritual origin of the mysterious noises. Communication with spirits appealed to devout Quaker reformers as an expression of the doctrine of inner light. It was some like friends preaching. I guess it means somewhat. It was some like friends preaching. They were relying on the Spirit, observed Isaac Post. The spiritual telegraph reconnected the lines of communication with God that they feared had been severed by Orthodox Quakerism's departure from its early practices. Congregational friend Sarah Fish initially greeted the raps with skepticism, but on reflection, she decided that they were within the bounds of Quaker teaching about communication between human and divine. I became perfectly satisfied that I had resisted the divine spirit in my own heart by making light of what that child said, she wrote to Amy Post following an early seance. Sarah Fish laid down her pen after writing the above line, then heard raps on her own bedstand. She asked that the raps repeat if she was correct, that they came at the moment to confirm the message of the light within. She heard more raps, which dispelled her last shreds of skepticism. I am more than convinced of the truth that our departed friends are with us, striving for our good, she concluded the next morning. Through networks of kin and friendship, news of the rap spread quickly to Quaker communities in Long Island, Nantucket, Philadelphia, and throughout New York State. The spiritual longings of the Waterloo Friends for intercourse with the infinite grew out of their Quaker heritage, but it overlapped with an urge shared by many Americans, the desire for communication with the dead. Investigators eager for news of departed loved ones, such as the Post's friends, Dr. Chase, asked for it directly. The Post learned in response to inquiries that the mediums could see Isaac's 3 dead sisters, as well as the Post's recently deceased 5-year-old daughter, Matilda. They always speak of seeing Matilda and say she is happy around us, Isaac wrote to his brother and sister-in-law. A son, also lost at the age of 5, but many years earlier, communicated as well by addressing their own spiritual needs and by asking the questions they did. The disaffected Quakers of upstate New York created a religious movement that would satisfy the yearnings of mid-century Americans across the country. More substantive communications began after Kate and Margaret's older sister, Leah Fox Fish, mother of 3 children, proved to be a medium. Leah was prone to headaches from which she found relief when Isaac put her asleep by magnetizing her. In the resultant trance state, she communed freely with spirits, especially those of Hannah Kirby Post, Amy's sister and Isaac's first wife, and the Post's departed children. I should like she could remain so happy when awake and so judicious, for she seems far in advance of her wakeful state, Isaac wrote to Amy. While in trance, Leah reasoned very philosophical. She looked right at Isaac and said that it was not true that first love was best, for after the object was removed, we are free to have the same feelings center on another. This remark held special significance for Amy and Isaac, both of whom lost a first love before marrying each other. The man whom Amy once regarded as her only source of earthly happiness died shortly before they were to have been married. Amy then went to live in the household of her older sister Hannah and Hannah's husband Isaac Post. When Hannah died, Amy stayed on to care for her sister's children and eventually married their father. 20 years later, having produced 4 children and buried 2 of them, Amy and Isaac Post found affirmation from spirit communication for the shape their lives had taken, as well as consolation for the many lost hopes they had once held dear. After a year of investigation, the spirits demanded a public demonstration of their intelligent communication. The spirits instructed Isaac Post and his cousin George Willits to rent the city's largest hall for 3 nights and charge the public 75 cents each to witness the Fox sisters' mediumship. Eliab Capron, that's my best guess, a congregational friend from Auburn, New York, was assigned by the spirits to deliver an address explaining the nature of the manifestations. On November 14th, 1849, 400 people filled Corinthian Hall to hear the mysterious noises. The meeting appointed a committee of skeptics to investigate and report back to a similar assembly on a subsequent evening. When this committee announced itself unable to discover any fraud or trick by which the girls produced the raps, the second meeting turned rowdy. Throughout, Amy Post lent Catherine and Margaret the aid of her gentle counsel and the strength of her irreproachable name. She accompanied them to the platform in Corinthian Hall and forced her way into a chamber where the disrobed and subjected to minute examination. Eliab Capron subsequently tried to induce the Fox girls' mother to permit them to travel to New York City to demonstrate their mediumship. Mrs. Fox initially objected, but in June 1850, she and her 3 daughters accompanied Capron to New York. They rented rooms at Barnum's Hotel, where Capron advertised public demonstrations 3 times a day, admission $1. These demonstrations attracted enough attention to create a demand for private seances for select audiences. A notable array of literati gathered at the home of a New York clergyman to hear the raps. Guests included author James Fenimore Cooper, historian George Bancroft, poet William Cullen Bryant, poet and editor Nathaniel Parker Willis, reformer and publisher of the New York Tribune Horace Greeley, and George Ripley, Greeley's head editorial writer, and founder of Brook Farm. According to Greeley, the seance puzzled most of those present, but impressed Cooper, who received accurate answers to questions about a sister killed 50 years before. Willis described the post-mortem soiree less sympathetically to readers of the Home Journal, noting the disinclination which these spirits seem to have for any intercourse with editors. Greeley became a frequent investigator and invited the Fox family into his home. There they conducted a series of seances at which Greeley's wife, Molly, received messages that she believed to be from her recently deceased 5-year-old son. Greeley proclaimed himself convinced beyond the shadow of a doubt of the Fox sisters' perfect integrity and good faith. He assured his readers in the Tribune that whatever may be the origin or cause of the rappings, the ladies in whose presence they occurred do not make them. Kate lived with the Greeleys the following fall, which brought much comfort to the bereaved family, but little to the young medium. "How I hate her," Kate wrote of Mrs. Greeley to her brother. "Why did I leave my mother? If you knew how sick at heart I am, you would come after me. My head aches so I can hardly write." The renown of the raps became a mixed blessing for the Fox sisters, who found themselves living among strangers with little control over their lives. "I'm very lonely. Oh, how I miss you," Kate wrote to Amy Post. But she also reported that the dear spirits are doing wonderful things. The previous evening, the piano was sweetly played upon by spirit fingers. The guitar was played, then taken up and carried about. Above our heads, each person in the circle was touched. She told Amy that the spirits ring bells and move tables, all when our feet are held. We have convinced many skeptical people. During the next few years, the Fox sisters demonstrated their mediumship in New York City, Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and Ohio. Leah Fox Fish, the oldest sister, remained in New York, where she received calls from inquirers at her seance room. Several influential abolitionist leaders, having heard of the Fox sisters from their friends in Rochester, visited Leah and were converted by the experiences they had there. William Lloyd Garrison, who had been attending seances for several years, visited Leah in 1854. That evening, in the seance room, 6 men and 4 women sat around a large table in what Garrison called the unusual manner, the hands of each resting on the table. The raps called for the alphabet and instructed the medium to put her feet in the custody of one of the party, to convince everyone present that the medium had nothing to do with the phenomena by way of fraud or collusion. The first spirit to identify itself was Jesse Hutchinson, member of the famous family of reform singers. The spirit beat time and raps while the circle joined in singing a Hutchinson family favorite, "The Old Granite Slate." Another spirit, that of an anti-slavery pioneer whose daughter sat at the table, identified himself and rapped out by the alphabet that spiritualism will work miracles in the cause of reform. He then indicated that he wanted the circle to see the physical power of spirits. He directed the party to put a bell under the table, which Garrison reported was rung by unseen power. He asked that paper be placed under the table, which, when retrieved, bore the first names of the 2 communicating spirits. Before leaving the seance, Garrison devised his own tests to confirm the spirit presence. He asked that Jesse Hutchinson grasp his right hand. He then secured his hand between his knees to prevent access to it by other members of the circle. Garrison then felt the touch of a hand with no warmth in it, while he saw the hands of all, including the medium, resting on the table. Garrison's abolitionist co-worker, Henry C. Wright, sat at Leah's seance table in 1851. He conversed with the spirit of Jesus, who rapped affirmatively to Wright's query whether he was mortal like other men. Wright announced himself well satisfied with the communications. As the decade advanced, other mediums produced new types of manifestations. Instead of raps and reeling chairs, investigators found spirits moving their hands to produce automatic writing, controlling their voices to speak directly, and using a variety of devices designed to facilitate spirit communication. Isaac Post became a writing medium and published a volume of communications from deceased Quaker reformers in 1852. Spirits began to control the voices of mediums, making communication much easier than the awkward alphabetic methods. Healing mediums appeared who could see inside the body and prescribe according to spirit instructions. Test mediums advertised their services to those who wished to question spirits regarding information that only a specific deceased friend or family member would know in order to confirm the spirit's identity. Speaking mediums might speak in the voice of a departed loved one or deliver a public lecture authored by their control. As more intelligent communications appeared from other sources, the public lost interest in the foxes and their raps. The Arctic explorer Elijah Kent Kane took an interest in Margaret and arranged for her support and education before departing for his second Arctic expedition in 1853. After his premature death in 1857, Margaret claimed that they had been secretly married and that Kane had left her an annuity. Kane's respectable family, not surprisingly, denied this connection with the medium. Margaret responded by converting to Roman Catholicism. The oldest sister, Leah, married Daniel Underhill, a wealthy spiritualist and insurance salesman, the same year. She continued to give private sittings but ceased to use her mediumship for profit. By the end of the decade, only Kate remained in public life. Engaged in a constant struggle with alcoholism, she eventually lost custody of her two sons when she was arrested for drunkenness in Rochester in 1888. Margaret, also addicted to alcohol, blamed spiritualism for her own and her sister's woes. Although the Fox sisters converted many influential people and provided the model for other mediums, they never participated actively in the movement they began. Their own lives riddled with alcoholism, poverty, instability, and loneliness, and add little to an understanding of the role of spiritualism in American history. They never appeared at conventions, contributed to publications, or cooperated with those interested in promoting the cause. They cooperated with, or perhaps more accurately, were exploited by only those interested in promoting the Fox sisters alone. By 1854, even the Fox's early supporter, George Willits, lost interest in them, although he was still an ardent spiritualist who frequently sought communications. Few go to see her, he wrote of Leah Fox Underhill to his cousins Isaac and Amy Post. When the medium Emma Hardinge, I don't know if it's Harding or Hardinge, sought material for the first history of spiritualism, she lamented Leah's unwillingness to contribute to the effort. However, she did not expect her proposed book to suffer because the Fox's story had been so much before the public that there can't be much to add. Clearly, she viewed their role in the movement as limited to the early events of their mediumship. I only asked in compliment to them, she explained to Amy Post. The more recent historian of spiritualism, Ernest Isaacs, concludes that the Fox sisters did possess extra normal powers of extrasensory perception, telepathy, and telekinesis, but that there is no evidence that these derived from spirits. From a historical perspective, whether the Hydesville rappings were produced by the spirit of a traveling peddler buried in the basement, or by a conscious or unconscious bid for attention by two imaginative young girls, is of little consequence compared to the massive popular movement that resulted. Whether or not Kate and Margaret controlled the raps, they did not determine the meaning attributed to them by observers. The interpretation of investigators, rather than the manifestations themselves, provided the content of the new religion. And do I keep reading here or stop? Probably should stop. Yeah, I'm stopping. I'm tired already. I'm tired, bruv.